to go ahead and kick it over to you. Make sure I get started and introduce yourself.
Sounds great. Let me share the screen. And I guess I'll start with a round of intros. I'm Nadia Davis. I'm VP of Marketing here at CaliberMind. And this webinar is a sequel. This is take two. We had a Attribution is Dead webinar about 2 months ago. Drew and I were within this community. Turns out it's not quite dead yet. So we figured we need a sequel. And this is what that is. So let me kick that over to Eric for an intro.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Eric Westerkamp. I'm the CEO of CaliberMind.
Drew, take us home.
Drew Smith, founder and CEO of Attributa.
Fantastic. So we got a very relevant crew. And what we wanted this session to be is more of a practical, kind of deeper dive guide. Attribution is one of those divisive concepts that just is always top of mind. And this recent poll on LinkedIn that I just caught, Marketing Ops Community, 43% of those who took the poll said, what is the biggest challenge? What's the likeliest break that happens? That's attribution. After the last webinar, we had someone who reached out to us, say, hey, that was great. We would love to have more of a deep dive session. So here we are. This is what we wanted to talk about. And Eric, I will turn that over to you to get us started.
Sure. Thanks. It's actually pretty relevant. Attribution, sort of the largest problem that people are talking about is attribution breaking at 43%. One of the reasons that's happening is that for exactly kind of what we're showing here is like this new buyer journey, right? Like there's so many touch points coming in from so many locations. There's so many applications now being used by marketing, especially in B2B and sales, that the buyer journey is getting harder to understand and map. When your buyer journey starts to fragment and you don't have all the touch points, that's when your attribution models start to break. There's a lot of other reasons technically, but when you have one or two channels using one or two applications and you can push all that data into Salesforce, it's pretty easy to have a simple first touch, last touch, or even MTA model. I think our average customer has 12 different data sources directly plugged into our system, with Salesforce probably managing 4 or 5 directly. So 12 to 15 different data sources, all sending data in around the buyer journey, right? Once you start to have that complexity, I think that's when you start to see things break down for attribution modeling if you don't have the right systems and structure. Drew, what do you think? And you deal a lot more with the Salesforce side of this. We deal with it on the marketing data warehouse side. What do you see?
Yeah, let's all be honest here. Marketing attribution, figuring out what works and doesn't work is incredibly difficult. It is not easy. This slide is one of the reasons it's not easy. If you've been in the B2B world for, 10 plus years, it's gotten nothing but more and more complex, and it's continuing to get more complex. And so with that complexity, marketing attribution gets more and more difficult itself. I think that we see the same challenges. Organizations have so many different data sources that need to be consolidated, so many different, and then ultimately, once you get the data consolidated, it's also just, there's so many ways to slice and dice the data that it almost becomes paralyzing. This whole problem is so complicated that it requires people to give it the level of care and thoughtfulness that a complex problem like this deserves.
Yeah. Something that we hear a lot of is prospects and customers will come to us and be like, I just want to know, maybe go back one to Nadia. I just want to know.
When you get there.
When you get there, they ask us often about like, I just want to know what the golden path is. I want to know, like, I just need to know what to do next. And I understand the desire to sort of see that golden path, because it really is like, how can I distill all this complexity to something I can really understand? The problem is, unless you're a really small organization with very few touch points, there is not a golden path. There's 10, maybe 15. And so you need to change the way you think about your buyer journey, not to, what's that path through here that if I just do this and then this and then this and then this, we get success, to where in this mess of, all these touch points, are there groupings of related activities that when I see a few of them, other ones become much more likely to move somebody down the path. And those groupings may change depending on who you're talking to, the type of industry that you're dealing with, and even the product line that you're selling. If you're a larger organization and you have 10 different products selling into multiple industries, these groupings are different. Because a lot of people are like, I've got this buyer journey, I've got this complexity, I just want to know this golden path through here. They need to reframe how they think about it to what are the groupings of related activities that when I see one, I now kind of know what other activities tend to relate to it and tend to happen in sequence to move somebody down my journey.
2 comments on golden path. Number one, my analogy for searching for the golden path is it's no different than searching for the golden city of El Dorado. It doesn't exist. You might find a whole bunch of other cities or paths along that way while you're trying to find El Dorado, but it ain't the golden path and it ain't the golden city. Number 2 is trying to find a golden path flies in the face of every ounce of buyer research that's been done over the last 10 years in B2B. B2B buyers want you to market to them the way they want to consume information. They want to be in control of their research and buying process. They don't want to be stuck in a funnel that applies to everybody the same way. And so if you're going to find a golden path, then you are essentially saying, I do not care about what the buyer wants. I'm going to feed them what I think works. And that's just not the way B2B buyers buy anymore.
Agreed.
Shall we do a poll?
We should do the poll.
All right. So for all of you guys on the call, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think attribution? There are choices out there. Maybe there are options that we might not have considered. Put a comment in the chat. But curious to know. Kim will let us know when we have enough answers and what those answers look like.
You're still trickling in, so I'll give folks a couple more seconds.
I feel like the crowd on LinkedIn, the vocal crowd, would probably go with attribution doesn't work. It looks like people start with which model should I use first? That was my question in the past. And then we tried it, but can't quite get it right. Eric, what's your take?
Well, I'd love to see this because it means that people are thinking about attribution. And I think that is the right question because different attribution models really help answer different questions, right? And we're going to kind of get into that. But you need to understand what questions are the most important for you and your team to try to answer, and then start to figure out what models are actually the right ones to support answering those questions, right? I'll give you an example. The CMO may need an attribution report that shows credit, shows impact of all of marketing's activities for budgeting reasons. I need to show all the things that marketing is doing so I can roll into a meeting with my CFO and prove that all the stuff I'm doing is having an effect on our revenue so I can get budget. That can be very different than the head of demand gen, which is like, I really need to know what specific tactics are working up here so I know where to invest. And they really need to know the ROI at a much more granular level. Those may be different reports, right? They may be different attribution models because you need to answer different questions. And it may not just be the difference between first touch and last touch and multi-touch. It may be that some models include some data and not others. Like your demand gen model might not want to see sales touches because you're not trying to prove the effect of your whole kind of marketing pipeline. You're trying to overweight all of those digital touches so you know what's actually having effect. You're trying to amplify signal out there. But then somebody else that's dealing with the crossover between marketing and sales, running ABM programs, they want all those touches in it. I'll stop there. Drew, get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that this thing of which model do I use becomes problematic when you try to assign a model at the company or organization level. And that's just the wrong way to think of models. I use an analogy for a different way to think of models, which is that attribution models are like going to the hardware store, like going to Home Depot or Lowe's and buying a set of wrenches. You get a set of 8 wrenches and you don't take the set home, pick the wrench that you think is going to work best for your house, and then throw out the rest of the wrenches. You use the models for different use cases. And so if you look at the model not as an organizational model, but rather something you choose at the report level to answer very specific questions, then this whole challenge of which model do I choose becomes completely stress-free, because we're not choosing one as an organization. We're fitting the model to the report to answer the question the report is asking. There's nothing wrong with, in a report, using more than one attribution model side by side. Sometimes you can see some really interesting stuff when you put 2 or 3 attribution models side by side. You can reveal interesting information. I recommend that you do that in support of proving a hypothesis. I have a hypothesis of X. I'm going to test that by running attribution model A, C, and F side by side to see if I can prove this hypothesis. That's a really great way of using attribution models that most people don't think of, because they think of, well, we got to pick one for our company. And that is the wrong way to think about it. And that's what causes a lot of this stress.
Do you guys want to do a deeper dive on each one of the models?
Sure, let's do it.
Since we promised people a deeper dive, let's go through all of them. Eric, take it away.
Yeah, first touch and last touch, I'll just kind of lump those together. They answer very specific questions, which is sort of like what got something in to my pipeline, and then kind of what converted it into an opportunity or a sale, depending on where you put your last touch. These are probably the easiest models. Most companies that we deal with have a version of this model running already inside of their CRM, Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or HubSpot. And that's because it's really only trying to track one touch point. The biggest gaps I see often is that the way these touch points are set, especially on last touch, is often left up to individuals who have to do drop-down boxes or mark something. And what I hear often from marketers is it's just not right, because we leave it up to the sales rep to actually use this drop-down in Salesforce to set what that the converting campaign or something is, and they don't always do it, or they always set up to this value. Right. And so without automation setting these things, I see these tend to break down. But when you have automation in place, they become significantly less biased. True thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the one thing that most people forget to think about when they think about last touch is last touch prior to what? Last touch prior to MQL, opportunity creation, opportunity closure, stage 2 pipeline. We have to be really clear in our definitions of last touch prior to what. When you get that clear of a definition, that's when you can start setting up automation that takes a lot of that subjectivity out of this equation. The more subjectivity you have, that just means you have more noise in your data. We can't really trust it because it's subjective. So that automation drives objectivity, which is what you want in data. Subjectivity is great for things like qualitative analysis, but quantitative analysis, you need that objective data, that last touch is the same way every single time, and there's no manual manipulation of it.
Yeah, that's great.
I think the other thing I just want to touch on is anytime there's manual manipulation, that can lead to mistrust. And all of your data, when you send data, when you're using data, it has to be defensible. The more you have manual manipulation of data or subjectivity in your data, that means that you can't defend your data as much, because it's like, well, why did you pick this as your last touch? Well, I picked it because I thought X, Y, and Z, and that's just, that causes problems with analysis and the trust of the data.
Yep. I agree 100%. That's one of the things that we push our customers to do with our best practices. They automate everything. You shouldn't really be relying on any of those. I think that's the benefit. We're now jumping to kind of U-shaped, W-shaped, maybe even weighted. I think this is where the multi-touch models really start to shine, in that they can start to show all those touches so you don't miss things. A lot of the bias starts to drop out of the model, right? So you may still have that field that the salesperson, sets over here, and that's in your model, but you're also going to see all those other touch points and marketing events that actually occurred prior to that. And so even if that's not accurate, you're going to see the rest of that buyer journey happening, right? The question is, and I'll get into like U-shaped versus W-shaped. This is really all about overemphasizing parts of your buyer journey and funnel to get to certain answers. U-shaped is really saying, I'm going to emphasize the stuff at the beginning of the journey, the end of the journey. I'm still going to track the stuff in the middle, but I don't want to give it as much credit because there's a lot of noise in there for some businesses. W-shaped is really start, middle, and end. It's like, hey, I want to know what happened before it converted to an MQL or an MQA and right before conversion to pipeline or close bookings, right? I still want to see everything else, but I want to weight them differently. And this really is a business decision. And a lot of this has to come down to analyzing, we found, what does your buyer journey look like? What is your buyer behavior? And then what people need answers from this so that they can make good decisions. And the weighting is really all about emphasizing the touch points so that the people who need to make decisions about what's converting into MQL can see that in an attribution model. Kind of going back to that, here's this giant jumble. Attribution is trying to take weak signal, lots and lots of little touch points, and pull sort of the signal out of that noise. Sometimes you need to overemphasize certain portions of it to be able to see what's going on. And that's where I think U-shaped and W-shaped actually comes into play.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I want to talk about with these multi-touch models is a lot of times people get really hung up on, well, why did this touch point get 30% of the value of the opportunity and this other touch point got 5% of the value, when subjectively it should actually be reversed. And when you look at it at the micro level, you can certainly make those arguments. Like I've seen it a lot of times where it's like, yeah, that actually makes sense. And then you move to the next opportunity and it's the exact polar opposite. And this touch point got 30% and the other touch point got 5%. So we need to move that money around. And what you end up doing is at the micro level, you're moving all of this money around. And then at the macro level, everything stays the same because multi-touch attribution is big data. You're talking about thousands of touch points over your time period. And when you have that much data, those minor inconsistencies at the micro level smooth out at the macro level. You have to let that go a little and say, I know there's an inconsistency or potential subjectivity at the micro level, but if we just start moving things around, it's all going to even out anyway. So let's just let the thing do its thing. When you let it do its thing, everything is playing by the same set of rules. If this one got 30% here, it's because of reason X. If it got 5% on the next one, it's because of reason Y. And everybody's playing by the same rules. All your channels, all your campaigns have the same rules applied to them. So don't get hung up at the micro level and trying to manage subjectivity and minor inconsistencies. Focus on the macro level and what that's telling you.
I love that. And it's actually why I actually often recommend even weighted or chain based for exactly that reason. Even weighted is like everything gets the same weight. There's no bias in it. And so now I can see what's going on. That's the one we use for our stuff. For the most part, we use chain based also. I like it because nothing is getting overweighted or underweighted. I can see exactly what's going on. Chain based is interesting because often teams get, when they micromanage the attribution model, you can really start to inject bias into the model. And bias is bad because if you're truly looking for answers, you don't want to bias it with your own concepts about what's working and what's not working, right? You just kind of want to let it come out of the data. Chain-based is great because there's no bias. There's no weighting. It's running statistical analysis on the data inside the system to basically come up with your weights. And boom, and then you re-weight it every whatever your training period is, and boom. And now there's no bias in this, right? And if you have a good model, you can pull out of that, what does it think are the more to less important activities? Because it kind of gives you those weightings back and says, I think these things, when we see them in this model, they tend to drive behavior the best.
So over the next few slides, we got some visuals, and I want to spend a little bit of time on each specific model. And I know we're starting with a single touch. I feel like the first touch and the last touch sometimes kind of gets scoffed upon because they're just simplistic. There's no use case, but I wanted to offer one of the use cases where first touch is what you want based on the question you're asking. For example, in my previous demand gen roles, when your goal is to expand a specific market segment, and your first question is, okay, where am I going to go for new contacts? Because at the end of the day, it's like, how many people do I have in my database? How many more people can I get from all of these different channels, whether it's partner relations, events? First Touch is a great one for that because it shows you where people started engaging with you first. So you're not trying to even attach revenue to it. You're just trying to understand, where do I go as my watering holes to expand my market share and drive awareness? I don't know if anything else comes to mind for you guys.
I've got a great example of this, like an actual real life client example. We were doing a go-to-market analysis for a client, and they were investing significant money into content syndication. They were using multi-touch attribution to understand how content syndication is performing. And when you looked at content syndication through the lens of multi-touch, it was actually performing really well. But is that the purpose of content syndication? No. The purpose of content syndication is to get net new names into your database from external sources so that you can nurture them and get them eventually over to sales. So when we looked at the content syndication channel solely through the lens of First Touch, its performance completely fell off a cliff. All they were doing with content syndication was paying extra money to engage people already in their database, which is ridiculous. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So we actually were able to find that content syndication was seeing a false positive through multi-touch models, but through the First Touch model, the true performance of that channel just fell off a cliff. We made the decision to drastically reduce the spend in content syndication.
I have a horror story on the last touch, if you guys want that. Well, I lived that reality. And I shared this story before, and I shared the other part of the story. But, my previous role, we had a new president that joined the company. And the question that was presented to me is, where do our opportunities come from? And before I got to the point where I was able to answer that question, I was running Marketo. So I had my first touch and last touch. And my boss said, you know what? Let's look at the last touch so that we know what happened right before account went into an opportunity. Great, the tipping point, right? Our last touch was set up to be driven by the date. So what was the last touch before today? It didn't matter when the opportunity was open. Up to today, the last touch was this, and the previous one was overwritten, right? You have to understand how the sausage is made. This is where you want to know how the sausage is made, right? To be able to answer those questions.
Yeah, and that's the challenge we see with a lot of customers, is that their data disappears. If their system of record doesn't have history tracking, information can be overwritten or something like that. Like, hey, a new MQA happens for this company that was in but got recycled, and suddenly you lose what happened on the previous cycle. What was the last touch before they converted to opportunity 6 months later? That gets switched, and now you have a new data field in there, and you lose that history. And so this gets down to making sure that if you don't have a good data architecture, you're not storing this data, you're not using history tracking, you're not managing this in a good way, your attribution can change over time, and it makes it hard to look back over time and generate an opinion. Are we getting better? Are we not getting better? Are we improving our modeling? Are we improving our activities? Things like that.
Yeah, this is a challenge that a lot of organizations face, particularly related to your funnel and funnel stages. When people re-MQL, or again, opportunity stages, people re-enter a new opportunity, that previous information gets erased. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can overcome this. History tracking is okay, particularly if you're turning that on in Salesforce. The problem with history tracking in Salesforce is it's not usable in reports. There are reports that include historic information, but you cannot actually relate those reports to any object other than the primary object. So if it's opportunities with history, you can't relate it to anything else other than opportunities. So you've got limited reporting capabilities. Your first thing that you need to understand is, do I need to track this for 2 trips, like 2 opportunities, 2 MQLs, or do I need to go more than 2? If you need 2, then you just need a first or original data point and then a most recent data point. That's how you can track 2 trips or 2 MQLs or 2 opportunities or whatever. If you need more than that, that's when you need to start looking at some sort of a customized solution, whether that's software-based or building in Salesforce, like a Salesforce custom object, to track the 3+. Because once you get to 3+, an original and a most recent data point will not hold all that information, because it only can hold 2 total pieces of information. You may not need the 3. We did an evaluation for a client that thought they needed this complex solution. And what we found is that we did some deep dives into their history information. We found that anybody that went through the funnel more than twice, the likelihood of them actually turning into an opportunity or a deal, that third trip through the funnel fell off a cliff so badly that it wasn't even worth tracking. Because the third trip was such a negative indicator, we decided not to create data architecture and infrastructure to support that, because you really only got 2 chances with this organization. If you didn't get it in the second chance, they were not going to become a customer. It was that simple. So we aligned on the original field and the most recent field. So
I'll give a bit of a counter to that. If your solution is built in an architecture that leverages the marketing data warehouse, this issue goes away, because the marketing data warehouse is going to pull across all of those values in the history and attach them to the right locations in the buyer journey. You can turn on history tracking and these issues go away because it gets built into the marketing data warehouse, and it can put all of these things on a continuous timeline for you, right? So I think that's why we're seeing the shift away from the CRM being the data store to the marketing data warehouse. And I'm a little bit biased on this one, but the marketing data warehouse being the data store handles and smooths out a lot of these types of issues.
I don't think that's a counter to what I said. That is perfectly aligned with what I said, because that's adding on the software element, right?
That's
software.
That's the software.
Yeah, that's the software element. But yeah, wholeheartedly agree, Eric.
Well, it looks like we're talking about more than 2 touch points at this point. So
now we're talking about multi-touch, right? And
Yeah.
so, we kind of went through some of these already. I would say that when you're dealing with multi-touch attribution, the thing that starts to be a bottleneck for customers is data and data consistency. The challenge now is when you're trying to track all of these events, you build models, the complexity goes up quite a bit from first touch or last touch. If you want to have models that give you good answers, you need to be focused on data and data pipelines that are building out the data and the models in a way that are consistent. This is the biggest challenge we see. We get a lot of companies that come to us and say, hey, we built out an MTA. And I said, I'll come back and say, have you ever had a report where the amount of attribution you're showing in your attribution report is greater than the pipeline in Salesforce? And they're like, that's because you don't have a good data pipeline consistency and data model that fixes those issues. We see that a lot. When moving to MTA, it's important to focus on those data and the pipelines and how you're building the models, and also making sure that your customers, for us, everybody understands how the model works. Because the problem is that you're going to get a lot of questions when you bring in MTA. Your CEO, your CFO are going to ask a lot of questions about, how did you get to that number? I'm seeing X, Y, or Z, and I'm seeing an anomaly. What happened here? If you can't drill in and explain what's going on, you can be really challenged at the board level or even at the C level.
How do you guys feel about the percentages? I feel like in a lot of cases, people get hung up on what that percentage value is for this or that. It becomes one of those hair-splitting exercises and opinions flow. To your point, Eric, once you tell them what's under the hood, they're like, oh, let me give you my opinion, what I think it should be. And then back to Drew's point, it's not massaging it manually. It's big data and kind of looking at over time, over a large amount of data points. What's your take?
I'll give it over to Drew. This is why I recommend things like even weighted and Markov and dealing with the C level and the board level. It takes away the bias out of the systems, and you can say to people, there's no bias. This is just what's coming out of the data. At that level, the conversation is usually about budgets, channels, and investment. And because that's at that C level, they're really thinking about what channels are working, what channels are not working, how much money are we spending here, and is it driving enough results that we want to continue the investment here? And so it's a different dialogue than which campaign, which event drove the most attribution. Do I want to do that next year? Do I not want to? Which digital ads are working best? That's a very different dialogue. Drew, I'll kick it over to you.
One of the things that I do is when I'm sending data like this, multi-touch data up to the C-suite, typically I'll avoid the percentages conversations entirely. And what I focus on is I focus on the purpose of the model. For this one, we use the U-shaped model, which emphasizes the touch points at the extreme top of the funnel. But for this one, because we're measuring pipeline, we use the W model, which cuts off taking anything after the opportunity was created. So you focus on the purpose and the use case of the model instead of getting down into the percentages. If they ask and get into the percentages, you have to drill in that deep. At that point, I explain that you can argue all day about what the percentages should be, but ultimately, it's applying the same logic to everything. Because everything's playing by the same set of rules, it doesn't matter what the percentages are. There's no such thing as a right percentage. What matters the most is that we apply it consistently across all the touch points that we have.
I want to kind of double down on that and say that that also really helps when marketing is trying to have the conversation with sales and they're both sitting at the same table. And marketing saying, this is what we drove. And then sales is like, well, no, we did X, Y, or Z. First, you need to have a model that includes sales touches. Whether or not it's the model you use for your demand gen person, your campaign manager, it may not be. But the model at the C-level has to include sales touches. Because if it doesn't, everybody, the whole sales organization is going to question, where's all, I did this and I did this and I did this. How come that's not in here, right? So it has to have that in there. But that's also why you need to use a model that doesn't have a lot of bias built into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you need to put in things like rules. The challenge you get when you start including sales touches is things like emails have huge numbers of touch points. So you do need rules that say, okay, I'm only going to include the first email to each individual at this organization from the sales rep as a touch point, so that you're not getting this huge spike of, okay, now we're in contract negotiations and there's 50 emails back and forth, and that pulls your attribution model towards sales. Once you do that, marketing and sales can get on the same page and be like, okay, we both agree to this. Now as a team, we can start making really good decisions about what's working in investment. Because at the end of the day, it's all about who's investing what where to get the maximum output, basically pipeline or revenue for the organization.
I actually was in an organization once where the email touches were completely excluded. We had a very suspicious sales organization that learned about the bots. So they thought that every email click would have been the bot, and they refused to give it any credit. And that's fine. You exclude the channel altogether. On the marketing side, we did look at that. But to your point, Eric, you have to choose what you want to include so that it's relevant and drives alignment. Drew, sorry, I cut you out.
One little trick of the trade here, particularly when you're going to include sales in any of this data, is when sales creates a lead, like whether that's through Zoom Info, LinkedIn Sales Nav, or they met the person seated on the plane next to them. The sales reps are usually very chatty. You have to make sure that that sales creation has a touch point that can occupy that first touch, because you will never lose credibility faster than coming into a meeting with sales and saying, well, the first touch was a marketing webinar, and sales goes, no, I met them on a plane. You will never lose credibility faster than if you walk into a meeting with that type of a data story. You're going to get laughed out of the room, and you're never going to have credibility ever again. So you have to make sure.
As long as they put a note in Salesforce, right? As long as there's a note in Salesforce.
That data has to be somewhere, right? But I agree.
Yeah, you have to have a way to action off of that sales creation. The easiest way to do it is, if sales is creating the record, there has to be a lead source. You create some sort of automation, whether that's in your marketing automation platform or in Salesforce, to create a sales activity for the creation or Salesforce campaign membership. You can then action upon to create that first touch point. That ensures marketing doesn't create first touch, take credit for first touches that actually were sales. That is so critical. The moment sales gets their hands on this data, they will look for where marketing is trying to take credit for things sales did. If you don't have this in place, they will find it and destroy your credibility.
Something that we've been doing a lot with customers is working on how to get the information about all the marketing touch points over to sales, so they start to see the interaction between the marketing touch points and what's going on in their touch points. For instance, we released a piece that'll push summarized buyer journeys using AI into Salesforce. So the sales team members see this little chart that shows, here's the marketing touch points, and here's my sales touch points, and here's the people we're working with. And again, it's trying to bring those teams together so it's not nearly as antagonistic. And they both start to see, like, we're working together to get these accounts closed. marketing is adding value because they're doing these things, but I'm also adding value. If you can start to pull together models and pull together the data that shows all of it, it helps also bring that alignment between the teams, especially if you're running ABM programs.
Well, now that you mentioned the Cadillac package, right?
Chain-based attribution, we've covered this a little bit. I like chain-based because, again, it takes bias out of models, right? It basically is an algorithm that goes through and it uses the removal effect and go pretty deep on it, but like it essentially comes up with pathways through the system that work, and it creates weightings for your different touch points, and then it retrains on some period. So as things drift and move, it actually reweights things, and that's actually one of the biggest advantages, is that unless you're using even weighting or something, a lot of attribution models, they stay static. And your business may be changing the types of things. So if you have weighting in there, it may need to change over time, right? Because it may be drifting. And if you have homegrown systems, often they just stay static for a lot of companies. They just don't change. Like, so now when's the last time we changed this model? 3 years ago. Okay, but the mix of things that you're doing are completely different. I like attribution because with the training, which can happen weekly, monthly, quarterly, it can encompass that directly.
Drew, anything from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I think is really important that you mentioned, Eric, is that the weighting may need to change over time. I think that's something that orgs don't really consider because they just think that the weighting is the weighting. We see this a lot when organizations are developing like a custom attribution model, whether that's, custom homegrown attribution system or a custom model within a software platform. They set a model and then it never changes. And that's not the point of a custom model. A custom model should change, particularly if you're making changes to your business process, sales process, and marketing process. If you change the way that you create opportunities, for example, in B2B, you've got the group of organizations that create the opportunity when the meeting's booked, and the group of organizations that create the opportunity at the completion of that intro meeting once it's been qualified. If you change how and when you create that opportunity, that should change any weighting you have in a model that's based off of opportunity creation, because one of them is way more highly qualified than the other. Therefore, something that happens in close proximity to that is more important. So you would need to alter any kind of model, particularly a custom model. In the case of chain-based attribution, it may do it automatically, but you have to keep an eye on how those weightings are happening. If you make changes to your processes, weightings may need to be changed as well.
My heart goes out to all the people who have to maintain that, all of the changes. It's not lead scoring. We're going beyond that. Lots of work.
Lots of work. Our team sits down with our customers every month, every quarter, and reviews the models. For your customers, you do exactly the same thing, where it's an ongoing process of sit down, how are things working, let's look at the reporting, let's review the data, let's review the models. It's also key for their customers to understand how the models are working. If you can't understand the internals of the model, of how the attribution is working, how are you going to know whether it's accurate, whether it's doing the math right?
So as we finish our conversation on all of the models, I wanted to call out one specific one. I feel like the W shape and the U shape people treat it as more exotic ones. It's like this black box that most people don't know when to use it. When I was on the customer side of CaliberMind, we had one specific example where once I got CaliberMind, that was the one that was an aha moment for me. So there was a segment within the market. This was the government space. Think about the government industry, like very legacy, very conservative, very aware of not making themselves known and having a digital foot trail. We had a segment within smaller governments where if we met them at an event, it was an in-person touch, and then we saw them on a webinar, but it would be an on-demand view. They did not want to show up in person because they were stealthy. So we would see them in person, then we would see them on the webinar, on demand. That was a sign that within 60 to 90 days, there would be an open opportunity if the salesperson caught it and did all the legwork. Once I realized that was the case, spending money on all of the other activities for this specific segment didn't matter anymore because the path was the same. That was the golden path, one of many for this specific segment. So that's kind of my anecdotal wrap up of the models. All right, with this, I think we got a second poll. I know we got 11 minutes left. Let's see what you guys think. When it comes to the proverbial question of what's working in marketing, we just talked about all the models. How do you answer that? Hopefully that's the day when you're out of the office when that question is asked, but maybe you just take it on and offer some insights. I like the last one where we just default to the brand conversation because everything is dead. If it's dead, I cannot be blamed for what's dead. We're brand building. Brand is important. I don't want to hate on that. I'm not even touching that.
That's very important.
We're measuring
Hard
things.
as a CEO to have a marketer come to me and be like, I'm doing this, I'm spending this many $1 million on marketing, and I'm growing the brand without being able to tie that back to results.
Oh, Eric, I'm spending money on the brand now.
Yeah, I know.
All right, let's see what the crowd has to say. Kamala, do we have the answers? Campaign level attribution from marketing automation platform, or the manual piece together. I used to do that. You do the anatomy of the buyer, you do the manual touch point journey along the timeline. Anything you guys want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think one of the things I will comment on is the number one result was manually stitching things together. And one of the things that is really interesting is a lot of times when folks up level their marketing attribution capabilities by layering on a software platform, they expect the software platform is going to reduce a ton of manual effort. And it does. It absolutely does. Because you no longer have to stitch all that data together from the CRM and from Google Analytics. You still have to do the analysis. You have to make sure that instead of taking the time to stitch the data together, now you get to spend your time on analysis, which is the more important part. If you're going to spend your time anywhere, it should be on analysis, not on manually stitching data together. So don't expect the time to completely go away. You shift that time to the analysis piece.
And I feel like that takes us to this deep dive, the stitching together. So Eric, take us through this. I want to make sure we got 2 minutes at the end to give the farewell gift to our audience.
All right.
So let's go into
And
flexibility.
you have a ton of questions, just FYI. So if we get so many
All right,
questions.
I'll just give 2 points on this, and then maybe we can move to, we've seen a lot of people that have flexibility versus ease. In a perfect world, everything for you is first touch. You can mark that in Salesforce or your map, and you can report on it, and your world is golden, right? As the world has become more complex, as we've used more channels, as signal becomes weaker because buyers do a lot more of their stuff kind of up, maybe beyond where you can see, the ease has to give away to the flexibility to handle that data. And then you have to automate on top of that, right? So we're seeing a large movement of customers that have had those kind of systems that are realizing they're starting to break down in a world that's much more complex. They're starting to realize we need to put some time and investment into this. But what we're doing now is building a platform or a system that's going to take us for the next couple of years, where it may not be as easy as this one over here, but it can handle changing channels, turning on and off different applications on the fly, things like that.
Every organization we've worked with on marketing attribution eventually gets to the level of maturity where they need a data warehouse at the BI layer to create the reports that answer complex business questions. It's not a question of if a data warehouse is right for you. It's more a question of when is it right for you?
Yeah,
because
I love
it
that.
will be right.
Yeah, I love that, which is it's more as you mature in your data sophistication, you're going to realize that you need a system that can handle more complex questions, deeper questions. And then as the organization you're with starts to grow and expand, more product lines, more reporting needs, because you got bought by a private equity firm, or you're now got, your C round or D round or whatever, or you're public, you start to see that need grow.
Yeah, it happens. It's just a matter of time.
Yep.
Fantastic. Oh, do we want to cover the build under the hood?
Oh, I'll just give 1 point on this, which is that when we start to move toward a data warehouse environment where you have a marketing data warehouse, you just need to make sure there's certain types of pieces that are involved in it to make it successful. At the end of the day, what you're trying to shoot for is a set of data and records that to be able to do that, you need to be able to plug into all these raw data sources, but you also need to be able to do things like transformations on the data, roles injections, things like that. We had a customer a few months ago that one of their agencies suddenly uploaded a ton of data into their Salesforce system, and they've tagged all the UTMs and everything wrong for the previous entire quarter. They had 2 days to get to their board reporting. All their data was wrong. The ability to fix that data was going to take about a week. If you have a system that has rules in it, you can actually transform that data on the way into a data warehouse, and boom, your reporting is accurate. And that's what we were able to do for them, is put some rules in to change and flip fields and do stuff on the way in, fix the data on the reporting, and then later they went back through and kind of fixed the source data. With a system that can do data manipulation, lead to account matching, rules injection, normalization, you get the ability to really fix data that may not be pristine out there as it's coming into the data warehouse.
One point I will make on this, which is Drew is genius. If you look at this schematic, attribution is just one thing. Everybody harps on attribution, which is that one little thing in the corner, but look how much has to happen. Without all of that, that attribution piece means nothing because it's superficial, it's thin, does not reflect all of the complexities behind it. So keep that in mind. And the one thing I wanted to leave our audience with, we just came out with a report that I'm super proud of. This is the State of Attribution, the 2025 edition. So what we've done with this report, we have talked to multiple people out in the field. We've listened to a ton of podcasts. We've done research old school way, where we went through reports and we looked at the evolution of what attribution kind of started out to be versus what the sentiment in the market is right now, and made some predictions of where we think it's going. We would love for this to be the annual report, the first inaugural one with this beautiful, beautiful periodic table. It's out there for you guys. You are the first ones to read it, fresh off the press. Mary's putting the link to the report. It's not gated, by the way. You're welcome. In the chat. So let us know if you find it useful. I think now, if you guys are okay, we can take questions. There's like 54 messages.
Yeah, we're not gonna get hopefully Kamala or somebody who's been.
Kamala, you're picking. Give us best two.
Yeah, Drew had a point on not debating over percentages. How do you plan budget for spend based on that point with multiple channels and multiple functions touching the prospect if we ignore percentages?
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm giving you the hardest ones.
Yeah, it's not so much that you ignore the percentages, it's just that you don't debate them. Because if you debate them, you're going to debate them for 3 months and there's no right answer. So you just have to settle in on this is the percentage that we're going to use, and it's going to be the same across all of our tactics and channels. We're not manually manipulating anything. Everybody's playing by the same rules, and this is how we're going to measure it. You're not ignoring it. You're just not putting it up for debate, quite frankly. That's really all it is.
Okay, so the next one I'm seeing is...
I saw one that popped up a couple times, which is like, what do you do about the dark funnel, the stuff that's happening before you get to attribution? You know, that's always a tough challenge because you can only act on information that you know about. And so we see a lot of people say, well, so much is happening in dark funnel, so I shouldn't do this over here. But that's kind of like giving up, which is saying, because I can't get a perfect answer, I shouldn't try to get any answer out of the data I have. Customers have a significant amount of first-party data and information at their fingertips. A lot of them don't even realize how much they have. In absence of having a perfect world where I could see everything going on, this is the data you have, and you need to make the most of it to make informed decisions. What you're seeing is other ways of trying to figure out the impact of these channels that are having on your business, right? Lift analysis, one way, things like that you can kind of run. You can run different types of analysis to see the impact. The reality is that a lot of organizations are starting to do more and more activities that drive people to their website so they can start to get that first party data and know the sources.
Yeah, so a lot of folks will tell you that because of dark funnel, you shouldn't do attribution. Instead, you should do self-reported attribution, or you should do post customer surveys.
All the new
answer
stuff
is not an either or. You should do all of it. There's nothing to lose by doing both self-reported attribution and traditional attribution and post-customer surveys. Yes, it's more work, but you're collecting more data and shining a light on those dark parts of the funnel where there's blind spots. Self-reported attribution has blind spots. Post-customer surveys have blind spots. Attribution they all have blind spots. So instead of focusing on, well, this one has a blind spot, so I shouldn't use it, fill the blind spots with all the methodologies. It's not an either or, it's a yes and. We're gonna do this one, and we're gonna do this one.
I love that.
We are out of time. I want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you, panelists, for sharing your knowledge. Have a great day.